Peace of mind. Once you have it, you wonder how you ever lived without it.
I believe that their happiness began when they bought that place.
I don't think he locked his house door because he didn't have nothing to worry about.
When someone takes that peace away,
This is my land, Warren.
Some of the accusations that he had made are ridiculous. It's ludicrous.
What the heck are you doing?
you'll do anything to get it back.
You keep poking somebody, they finally break.
I laid on the pickup seat and I just cried and stared.
Nobody's lives are worth property.
They call Minnesota the land of 10,000 lakes. For a family that loves the outdoors, Warren, Marcy, and their 3 kids have certainly come to the right place.
When we first went into the house, my mom seen the view through the patio door of the house. First thing that you see is the lake view, and it was breathtaking for her, and she fell in love right then and there. Us kids were all very excited for the new lake house. We're absolutely thrilled to be there.
Oh, smile.
It's a long way from the hard Scrabble life they were used to.
When I grew up, we had a dairy farm. Mom and Dad both worked full-time jobs. They would rotate back and forth with the farming along with their jobs.
Warren is a manager at a factory over the state line in Wisconsin. Marcy has a full-time job too. Running the farm on top of that made for long days, and that was hard on everyone.
I think they wanted out from the stress of it all. They thought that the best way to get a new, fresh start would be to buy a new place.
Marcy just loved that house on the lake. She just thought that was ideal.
I believe that their happiness began when they bought that place and moved there.
For Warren and Marcy, this place just felt right.
I think Mom's most important things in life were love. Family was very important for her.
The children are 16-year-old Nikki,
I was always with my dad. I was Daddy's little girl.
12-year-old Jody, the middle child,
I think she probably tested my parents the most out of any of us kids growing up, just because she was so stubborn and so strong-willed, but yet on the same hand, she was so soft.
and 10-year-old Eric, adored by everyone.
He had the most beautiful eyes. And his dad had them same kind of eyes. You know, they were just woman getters.
There was one more family member who made the move from the farm.
We're used to animals and always having dogs around, so it was nice to have Ben. We had a lot of late nights outside, just playing night games. Family lived next door. They had 3 kids, and their kids were all about the same age as us. We're absolutely thrilled to be there.
But these happy times didn't last.
When the neighbors ended up moving, I think it was sad for all of us. There was no other kids in the neighborhood, you know, it was all older people, retired people.
The new neighbor, Paul, fits right in. Except, at 72, he's recovering from open-heart surgery. So a country house that requires upkeep seems an unlikely choice for him.
He was advised by his surgeons that he shouldn't work so hard and do the things like snow blowing and shoveling and the yard work.
But since his surgery, Paul's been stuck in an apartment in the city, and it's killing him.
I knew he wasn't gonna last long in an apartment. He just wanted a lake home and he bought it, and that's where he was moving. I think he saw this opportunity as a last chance to have something that he loved to do.
When Paul looks out the window, he sees the same spectacular view that Marcy and Warren fell in love with.
It's way up on a hill. You see the lake below and then trees in the background. It's kind of like looking off of a mountaintop.
Who could have imagined that great new beginnings would end so tragically?
Build a fence.
My mom right there. Oh, get up.
At first, our new neighbors get along just fine.
Howdy, neighbor. I thought you should meet all the kids. This is Nikki, Eric, Jody,
And I want you to put them to work anytime, okay? Come on, kids.
When Paul first moved in, my dad had gone over and told him that if he ever needed help with anything, that he had 3 children very capable of helping him.
Paul is a one-time military man, a retired printer who loves precision and order. But Warren also sees the other side of Paul, a down-home country boy who, like him, can't get enough fresh air. He even takes the older man to his dad's farm.
Hey, Dad. Hey. How you doing?
My dad introduced him to my grandfather and, you know, tried to get him to mingle with him a little bit, just kind of, you know, maybe give him places he could go, people to interact with.
Hey, I want to introduce you to Paul.
How about the place next door?
That's good, yeah, sure. Well, the whole, yeah, right to the tree line. That's that's the end of it.
Warren tries everything he can think of to make our new neighbor feel welcome.
There was a restaurant in town where all the old guys used to hang out and shake dice. So Dad showed him where that was and said, you know, this is the place to be from this time to this time because they're all in here shaking dice for nickels, so.
But his efforts to befriend the senior come to naught. Clearly, Paul prefers to keep to himself.
My father was a very private individual. It was just his upbringing. He enjoyed being outdoors from morning until night. And my mom would always say that she felt that he invented projects just so that he can be outdoors.
He was out pushing the lawnmower. We would go over and ask if he wanted us to do it. He never took us on the offer, so.
The two men are polar opposites, though one thing they both enjoy is the thrill of the hunt.
When I was 12, I went in for my firearm safety certificate and passed it, and then from that point on, I started hunting with my dad.
Oh, we're so close, honey.
I think I probably had him wrapped about as tight as I could get around my finger.
Warren loves being out on the land so much, he doesn't notice when he trespasses on private property.
There were approximately 13 neighbors that had signed a petition to keep him off their land during hunting season.
But he's too strong-willed to let a few complaints stop him from doing what he wants.
What you hunting? Mostly air. You get any?
I didn't do so well.
First lesson is safety.
Good, she's good. Come on. Hey, oh.
Warren, the good-time family man, and Paul, the quiet, meticulous loner.
He was very regimented, I would say. He preferred things to happen at certain times.
At Warren's house, things are a little more chaotic.
Warren always had people come over.
Oh my gosh. Sometimes as high as 30 people. The brothers, when they each have a beer or two, they all get a little boisterous, you know, and the way they talk to each other. You thought fists would be flying, and it never once. It was just all a big party.
And we holler at each other. But 2 seconds later, we're just like this.
The lake is everyone's dream come true. Hard to believe it's soon to become a place of blood and horror.
My parents ended up buying a boat, and it was a 1969 Larson old-time speedboat. It had a 100-horse motor on it, and Dad thought it was just the cat's meow.
Smile.
Dad would always forget to put the plug in the boat, so every time we'd drop it in the water, we'd notice water seeping in from the back of the boat. It was pretty funny.
For Paul, just getting to the water is tricky.
The hill to the lake was steep. You had to, you know, lean sideways and dig your heels in to get to the bottom of it.
Hey, Paul. Use our stairs and the dock here.
No, I'm okay, Warren. Warren, I'm fine. I'm good.
Historically, neighbors on this property had shared the stairs and dock. That's the way folks do things around here. But that isn't Paul's style.
He really liked to have his land defined. You know, this is my area, and then I respect that that's your area.
It turns out Paul's a stickler for boundaries. It's caused problems before.
The past neighbors of Paul had reported that they had problems with Paul over property lines. He would contest those or would not be in agreement with the property line.
At the county surveyor's office, Paul studies the official plat book, which defines the property lines along the lakeshore. He makes a discovery that changes everything.
My dad started looking at the property lines, and he felt that it wasn't matching on the one side with the one neighbor. And when he really got to measuring it out and looking at it, it really even appeared that the neighbor's dock was actually on my father's land.
Paul quickly locates Warren and gives him the news.
I want to show you these markers. These are the old property boundaries. Tell me that's your this is the property?
That property line had been there since 1953 when the property was put there. The dock was there, part of that property.
Will you move your dock? That ain't gonna happen.
Two stubborn men in a feud over land. Between our neighbors, nothing is ever the same again.
Dad was upset, you know, and Paul was upset.
I remember feeling genuinely concerned for his safety.
Build a fence if I have to.
And I don't think that my father's intention was to say, this is my line and you can no longer cross my line. It was to lay out, this is truly where the property lines are.
Warren and Paul were good neighbors. But now a dispute over boundaries is whipping up some bad blood between them.
Will you move your dock? That ain't gonna happen.
His neighbor became upset because he may have had some type of gentleman's agreement in the past.
Build a fence if I have to. Are you out of your mind, old man?
I think Paul had a genuine concern that if a physical fight were to ever break out, could he defend himself?
We're not moving anything, okay?
The confrontation ends in a standoff. Still, both men know the hostility is just beginning. Warren and Marcy keep up their get-togethers, while Paul quietly stews next door.
Warren mentioned the problem a little bit to me. He called me up one day to home and told me what was going on. Warren said, no, the property line was right on.
My husband tried to tell Warnie, I think you better watch him.
He wasn't a very nice person.
Hey, no worries. It's just an annoyed neighbor. Guys, we're having a party here, okay? Who wants to have a party with me?
That fall, the men avoid each other. Commuting to his job in Wisconsin keeps Warren busy. The rest of his time is spent prepping his beloved lakefront for the approaching winter.
In the fall, you have to take the dock out of the water because then when it freezes, the ice will destroy it.
But Paul is determined to claim what he feels by right is his.
He had contacted a surveyor to survey the land to do the right thing.
The surveyor agrees with him. Warren Stairs and Dock appear to be on his neighbor's land. To mark the new division, Paul starts putting in fence posts.
What the hell is he doing? Oh. What the heck are you doing?
My dad said, I don't know anything about it. Why am I not involved? It's my property that you're taking, Paul. We'll have it surveyed, and I think we should both be present when this is done.
Just because a survey is done doesn't give anyone any property rights in the area that was surveyed. The court is going to determine that either the plaintiff or the defendant owns that property.
As far as Paul's concerned, though, there is no doubt.
This is my land, Warren.
We always share this. Everybody shares this. This is our land. Just... Yo, cool.
Warren calls the authorities, who tell him the only way to resolve things is to go to court. But that will take months and cost a lot of money. When the harsh Minnesota winter rolls in, the dispute goes into hibernation. Paul takes refuge indoors.
Cheers. Long overdue. Glad you came. It's been a long way.
Leaving Warren's kids to enjoy the snow.
In the winter, all of us kids like to go sledding and tobogganing down the hill.
And when sleds are flying, there's no controlling where they'll land, which is what happens with Eric and one of Paul's property markers.
I think Eric ended up, maybe running over a flag and going towards the bottom of the lake where the sled may have run it over.
Legally, once a marker is removed, it can only be replaced by a surveyor.
It's okay. It's not your fault.
Okay.
But you can't just put it back in the hole. You'd have to remeasure to make sure that it does line up again.
That stake is very important because it is that monument. The surveyor has to tie into monumentation in the general area to verify that that monument is what it is.
Spring brings our neighbors outside again. And that's when Paul finds the marker knocked over.
I think Paul thought that we were deliberately pulling them out of the ground, and that was never the case.
It escalated where we heard that a pin down by the lake had been pulled up, and he had to have the surveyors come back out.
It doesn't matter anymore who's right or wrong. No one is backing down. And Paul is about to throw oil on the fire. Warren arrives home one day to bad news. Paul has gotten the jump on him, placing his own dock in the spot where Warren has always put his.
Get off my property.
Can't just take our spot. We have rights.
My father then began reacting back because now he's reacting to protect what is his.
The altercation ends in simmering fury. The consequences will be deadly.
I never had a clue that it would ever go that far.
Never take it out on my kids.
Sharing would have been a beautiful idea, For us to be kicked off of it is, I think, just absolutely absurd.
Because of the sloping shoreline, there's only one good spot for a dock on this part of the lake.
My dad, he didn't think it was fair that we wouldn't be able to use our own dock.
Paul claims the land is his, and he's not interested in sharing.
You can't just take our spot. We have rights. It's called historical usage.
Get off my property.
Who get off our property?
This drives Warren into a white-hot rage.
That's the new property line. Get off my property.
This is not your property. This your property, huh? How you like that?
He tries to fight back, calling a surveyor of his own. But to bring him out will cost more than he can afford. Paul, meanwhile, is enjoying his new dock and the boat he's found for his favorite pastime.
My dad loved being on the lake. He would definitely make time to go out and go fishing.
He also starts a home improvement project with the help of his son, Eric.
He wanted to re-roof the house. I think he was beginning to realize that most of these things he couldn't necessarily do all on his own.
Paul takes meticulous care of his property, so when he discovers little surprises on his lawn, he's infuriated.
He would run over rocks or, things that maybe he felt that were put there to just maybe make his life a little bit harder.
Who did this? Bet you those kids.
His son offers to intervene, but his independent father will have none of it.
He didn't want that burden to fall on me as well. There was no need to make me worry or pull me into it. So really his belief that certain things were dealt with on your own.
After a week of hard work, father and son finish the roof. Paul's daughter-in-law, Tara, comes by to make dinner. Again, there are more pranks. This time, dog excrement.
It seemed as if maybe the young kids were instructed to be mean by throwing things at him, rocks, dog droppings.
It'd never be anything that we would do. We would be in deep trouble.
Paul claims that every time he goes fishing, there is more harassment. Now he thinks Warren's young son is using him for target practice.
All kinds of things go through your head. Are they doing it on purpose? Are they just trying to scare him? Did they see him? Did they not see him? And what could this lead to?
I don't know what the target practice thing is about. I have no idea. That doesn't make any sense to me. My little brother had a BB gun. Some of the accusations that he had made, just ridiculous. It's ludicrous.
The complaints keep getting more serious, and now both men are getting nervous.
When Warren looked at me and he said, George, he said, you don't suppose wants to shoot me out here? I said, no, Warren. He wouldn't be that crazy. And Warren says, I feel he's watching me with a gun.
One day, gunfire does ring out over the lake. But it's Paul, not Warren, who hits the deck. The old man is terrified. He calls 911.
You start hearing stories of police needing to be called to come out. You would get this sense that things were building. You could see it.
But according to Nikki, Warren never fired on anybody.
Yes, my mom had bought him a new rifle. And I know one time he had shot it out over the lake, but it was just that time that I remember it.
Well, you want to believe that he saw him, that it was an accident. You don't know. When things were getting so bad, you don't know.
Warren's had enough of being denied the dock. He refuses to recognize Paul's claim and tells his kids to treat it as their own.
My dad believed that until things have been settled, it's still our dock. Go ahead and use it. Go fishing, go swimming, do what you need to do.
No surprise, this doesn't sit well with our neighbor.
Hey! Get off of the dock!
Yelling and cussing and swearing to get off of his property and to stop throwing rocks in the water.
In the land of 10,000 lakes, a dispute over property is spinning out of control.
Hear this, everybody. You can't just take our spot.
Warren was real protective about his kids. And if the kids had it coming, Warren was going to discipline, not somebody else.
Don't you ever, never take it out on my kids.
Our dad had telling Paul, we will take it to court and we will have it settled legally. One way or another, this has got to come to an end.
Paul decides to beat Warren to the punch. He calls on authorities to learn exactly what his legal rights are.
I'd like to help you, but this is really a civil matter, and my suggestion is to go get yourself a good lawyer.
For a $3,000 retainer, the lawyer launches a civil suit and sends his own surveyors to take new measurements.
What are you doing? I think my husband should be here.
The day of June 20th, a mom had taken off work that day. I had to have my wisdom teeth cut out.
Marcy calls Warren, who heads straight home. For him, this is the last straw.
And my dad said, nothing's getting moved until I see with my own eyes where this property line is going to be.
This is... Surveyors are here, because I requested.
Yeah? I never touched your stake.
Somebody did. That's $300.
Yeah?
Well, what you gonna do about it?
Paul threatens to summon police if Warren removes one more stake.
It just got to the point where my father just didn't have any more answers. After trying to resolve it by talking to the neighbor, there was no more solutions.
16-year-old Nikki can't deal with the tension. She wants to go into town.
Are you all right, Dad?
So I was invited to go to a baseball game. And when I asked Mom if I could go, she said, absolutely not, no way. She said, you're on narcotics, you're on pain medication.
But as usual, her dad can't say no. At home, Eric and Jody can't resist going back to the dock. It brings Paul's blood to a boil.
Hey! Get off of my dock. Come on, get out of here!
My brother and sister crying, saying, he was yelling at them to get off of his dock and to stay away from it.
Warren drops Nikki in town, her face still swollen from her wisdom teeth extraction that morning.
Hey! What are you laughing at?
So funny. He's like, he goes, sweetie, he said, I can't help it. He said, but you look so funny. I remember him looking at me and saying, if there is anything in the world that I could do to take your pain away, I would do it in an instant.
I love you so much, sweetheart.
I said, I know you do. I love you too.
If only time could have stopped right then.
Have fun. Hey.
Somebody was possibly dead, or somebody was dying.
For exclusive footage, go to investigationdiscovery.com.
On June 20th, 1996, the local deputy sheriff was called by Paul.
When the deputy arrives, Paul lays out his complaint.
Sheriff, thanks for coming.
The deputy sheriff reported that Paul had told him about the children being on the dock and that he was worried about it because of liability purposes. He also showed when the deputy what was the surveyed property line and the fact that the next door neighbor, Warren, had removed a stake that was placed there by the survey crew.
I'll let you know.
The deputy told Paul that he would do what he could to help resolve the issue of the children being on the dock.
Warren returns from dropping off Nikki. The deputy asks if he and his family have been deliberately provoking Paul.
My boy cry. And that is something I can't put up with.
My dad said no. He said, there's an issue with this property line. It'll get handled legally like it's supposed to.
Warren took the deputy down also to show his perspective of where the property line, where he believed it to be.
Despite the conflict, the deputy notes that both neighbors are calm and reasonable.
The deputy did ask if they could keep the children off the dock until the matter could be resolved in court, and Warren's family did agree to that.
You just let the courts handle this situation, all right? You get yourself a lawyer and let them talk, let them deal with it, all right?
Yes, okay, thank you.
A good night.
Sheriff, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
It seems like the crisis has been diffused.
The deputy felt that things were calmed down, and both parties indicated they did not seem upset at the time. The deputy then left that area, continued during his evening of patrol.
Paul retreats indoors and returns to planning a long-awaited fishing trip.
He had been reminiscing through this photo book.
But his reverie is suddenly shattered. What happens next is not fully known.
There was a very short period of time from when the deputy left, roughly 11 minutes. We aren't sure exactly what transpired during that period of time.
What a great time! Like party!
I speculate that the neighbor must have still been upset. Didn't feel that there was proper resolution, and was most likely outside yelling, hollering, perhaps calling my father names.
Whatever transpired, it pushed Paul over the edge.
You keep poking somebody, and you keep poking them, and it doesn't matter how calm and reserved they are. You keep pushing and pushing and poking to that point where they finally break.
I know my father-in-law would have never hurt somebody. You have to think, what happened? What did he do? What did they both do?
And it just got to the point where my father just didn't have any more answers.
Never take it out on my kids!
For all of us, what followed continues to live in our nightmares to this day.
Paul had left his home with a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol and returned back to Warren's residence.
Minutes later, neighbors are calling 911 with reports of multiple gunshots on Warren's property. Nikki's cousin Tammy picks up the news on the local police scanner and tracks Nikki down.
Nikki, she said, I heard over the scanner that there's been a family of 5 shot. And it was your address. She said, is everybody okay? And I said, yeah, Tam. I said, I just left home.
Nikki tries to call several times, but the line is dead. They arrive at a chaotic scene.
I remember getting out of the car and I was gonna run to the house. And I got stopped and I got approached by, I don't know if it was a sheriff or an investigator. They said that I needed to go to the hospital. They had advised me that when I got to the hospital that I needed to contact a priest. So I knew that somebody was possibly dead or somebody was dying. I wasn't sure. I got back in the car with Tammy and we drove to the hospital.
Nikki is frantic with fear and dread, but still can't imagine the horror of what's befallen her family.
When I was in the hospital, I was put into a waiting room. My hopes were is that one person had maybe been hurt.
The full story is almost beyond comprehension. As police tell it, violence exploded on the lake just moments after the deputy left.
The deputy sheriff, approximately 11 minutes after leaving the 2 neighbors, received a call to return back to Warren's residence and Paul's residence as there had been a shooting reported. At the time when the deputy got to the scene, he proceeded very cautiously onto Warren's property and up around his house where they noticed the first bodies, that of Warren and his daughter, on the patio area.
Miraculously, Jody was still alive, but paramedics couldn't get to her.
We pulled up to the scene and I jumped out of the rig and I had the jump box with me and I'm running up to the house and one of the officers hollered at me, "Rick, get behind a tree. There's been a shooting. We don't know how many people are involved."
Get somebody out here. We might be over here shooting us next.
He was the last one alive.
We know there's 2 or 3 down and the shooters, we're working up to get to the shooter.
At Warren and Marcy's lakefront home, neighbor Paul has gone on a killing spree. First responders are scrambling to figure out what happened.
They had the shooter, he had shot himself and he had the weapon, but he was still alive. And one of the sheriffs hollered, "When do you guys get over here?" So I immediately went over to the neighbor, and we started working on the neighbor.
12-year-old Jody is the last surviving victim, fighting for her life, while Nikki tries to grasp the scope of the tragedy.
It was kind of like, I was outside of myself. And it wasn't registering, really.
As her sister's life hangs by a thread, Nikki learns what her neighbor has done.
Apparently, Paul had shot my dad in the back of the head. When my little sister saw what had happened, he turned and shot her. My little sister, as stubborn as she was, somehow survived 3 bullet wounds to the chest and was still fighting for every breath. My mom is already on the phone trying to dial 911, and he shot her.
Paul ran out of ammunition for the .25 caliber pistol. He returned back to his residence.
My little brother grabbed the phone to talk to 911.
Oh, shot your parents? Where do you live? What's your address? My sister, my mom, my dad. Okay, but what's your name? Eric?
At that time, the 911 system was not as we know it now, that you had to actually give them a physical address and tell them exactly where you lived.
Eric didn't know his street address. The dispatcher didn't know where to send help. Our neighbor Frank had also called 911.
Well, Frank was on the phone with the 911 operator. He also observed a man walking from Warren's house in the direction of Paul's house.
My neighbor just shot the other neighbors up here. They live on the ground. Whereabouts?
Back at his house, Paul called his ex-wife.
He made that phone call. She needs to come now.
You need to come.
Meanwhile, little Eric was still struggling to explain his location to the dispatcher.
When you have mail come to your house, you must have a different address than that.
His life now depended on finding a piece of mail.
They said, Eric, we need you to stay on the line. We need to know where you're located. Why didn't they tell him, you need to go hide somewhere?
Based on what Paul did next, hiding would have been a good idea.
Paul obtained a semi-automatic .22 caliber rifle.
He's carrying a rifle. He's got a rifle.
Frank also saw that what he believed to be the same person returned back to Warren's residence with a long gun. Frank reported that after the same person turned the rifle on the dog and shot the dog, and that he fired it twice more into the bodies that he had earlier shot.
He's shooting again.
He just shot him here? Yes, he just shot him from my house.
But Paul still wasn't done.
Eric.
He ripped the phone line out of the wall while my little brother was on the phone with dispatch. He was the last one alive. He had already witnessed everybody being shot. I can't imagine his fear. I can't fathom how scared he was. My mom and little brother, they had died in the stairs.
All efforts to save Jody fail. Nikki is the only one of her family left alive.
And I remember after I identified Jody, walking down the hospital hallway and seeing Paul in a hospital bed. And I found out later that he had committed suicide after he had done it.
It appears to authorities that 11-year-old Eric was the last victim. The boy was found in the house alongside his mother.
I seen Warren and his daughter laying on the ground there, and I knew that this thing had finally come to a head.
Paul's son and his wife rushed to the hospital.
And we got to say goodbye to him. There was just a large gathering. The other family. It felt kind of like guilt is on us.
But this isn't how Nikki sees things.
I don't hold any anger towards them. You know, they're just as innocent as I am.
Hundreds of us came to the funeral.
I couldn't have asked for any more support. It was huge.
I've never seen so many people gathered in one place in my whole life. To see 4 coffins in a row of one family, I don't ever want to have to go through that again.
He was real happy, and they lived by the lake, and they really loved that place. And it was something, I guess, they were looking for all their life.
Paul's service was a much more intimate gathering.
We had a small service on the chain of lakes that he lived on. Nobody's lives are worth property. I have to believe that this situation did not need to get to where it did.
For our community, Paul's deadly rampage is still a mystery. We buried 5 neighbors that week, but none of us can answer the most obvious question. Why did Paul do it?
Everybody has that line, something had to have happened that set him off to the point that he fired that first shot.
For Nikki, there are no answers either.
If I could talk to Paul, I don't even know what I would say to him. How you can allow yourself to become...
The door was unlocked, not forced, not broken, just left that way, like someone walked out and never came back, or like someone walked in who wasn't supposed to be there at all. August heat clung to the small Texas town like a second skin in 1995, thick, unmoving, suffocating. Cicadas screamed from the trees. Lawns baked under a white sky. And inside that quiet suburban house on the edge of town, something had already gone terribly wrong. Something that would sit unsolved, untouched, and festering for decades, whispered about in grocery lines and church pews, filed away as just another cold case that never gave up its dead. Until it did. Her name was Lisa Carter, 27, a schoolteacher, the kind of person neighbors described the same way every time, kind, predictable, safe. The kind of person who locks doors at night. The kind who doesn't just vanish from her own life. But that morning, Lisa didn't show up for work. At first, no one panicked. Teachers get sick. Cars break down. Life happens. But by noon, something felt wrong. By afternoon, it felt worse. And by the time her sister stood in front of that unlocked door, calling her name into a house that answered with silence, the story had already shifted from routine to something darker, something colder. Inside, the air was still. A glass of water sat on the kitchen counter, half full, a chair slightly pulled back. No signs of struggle, not at first glance. No broken furniture. No blood splattered across walls like in the movies. Just absence. Just a life interrupted mid-motion. But investigators would later say that's what made it worse. Because it meant whoever came in didn't need to force anything. They were let in. Or they already belonged there. The initial search turned up nothing, no body, no weapon, no clear suspect. Just fragments. A missing purse. Cars still parked outside. Keys gone. And a single detail that would haunt the case for years. A faint, partial fingerprint on the inside of the back door. Smudged. Incomplete. Useless. At least by the standards of 1995. The town tightened overnight. Parents walked their children to school. Doors that used to stay open were bolted shut. Conversations dropped to whispers whenever Lisa's name came up. Because in a place like that, crimes don't just happen, they echo. And this one didn't stop echoing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Leads came in, then collapsed. A co-worker with an alibi, too clean to question. A drifter seen near the highway who disappeared before police could track him down. An ex-boyfriend who swore he hadn't spoken to her in years. And for once, the phone records backed him up. Nothing stuck. No body meant no crime. At least not one that could be proven. And without proof, the case began its slow descent into that quiet, bureaucratic graveyard where unsolved files gather dust and hope thins out year after year. But the town never forgot. Every anniversary, the same questions resurfaced. What happened to Lisa Carter, who walked through that door? Why was there no sign, no trace, no ending? The file was stamped, shelved, labeled, cold case. And that's where it stayed. For 23 years. Until a box was reopened. It didn't start with a breakthrough. It started with boredom, or maybe persistence. A junior investigator, assigned to review old files, pulled Lisa's case from storage not because it stood out, but because it didn't. No resolution. No closure. Just loose ends tied into knots. By then, everything had changed. Technology had caught up with the past in ways no one in 1995 could have imagined. DNA databases had grown. Forensic tools had sharpened. Evidence that once meant nothing could now speak, if someone was willing to listen. And buried deep in that evidence locker, sealed in plastic and nearly forgotten, was a single item. A fragment. Skin cells, barely visible, lifted from that same back door where the fingerprint had failed. Back then, it was useless. Now, it was a voice waiting to be heard. The sample was sent for testing. Days passed, then weeks. And when the result came back, it didn't just reopen the case. It detonated it. Because the DNA didn't belong to a stranger. It belonged to someone who had been there all along. Someone interviewed. Someone dismissed. Someone who had stood in that house, answered questions, and walked away, free, unnoticed, invisible in plain sight. A long-time suspect. Except back then, they weren't a suspect at all. They were just part of the background. And suddenly, the past wasn't past anymore. It was breathing again. And it was pointing directly at a name no one expected. The name didn't surface with a bang. It surfaced quietly, almost politely, printed in black ink on a lab report that didn't understand the weight it carried. No flashing lights. No dramatic music. Just a match, clean, undeniable, precise in a way 1995 could never have been. And that was the problem. Because the name on that report had already been inside the house. Not once. Not suspiciously. Not in a way that triggered alarms. Just naturally. Casually. Like someone who belonged. Daniel Reeves. 32 in 1995. A maintenance contractor. The kind of man who fixed things no one else noticed. Loose hinges, faulty locks, squeaking doors. He'd worked in half the homes on Lisa's street at some point or another. Quiet. Reliable. Forgettable. The kind of person who could enter your home, walk through your life, and leave without leaving an impression. Except he had left something. He had left himself behind. Back then, his name came up early. It had to. He'd done repair work on Lisa's back door just 2 weeks before she vanished. A minor job. Alignment issue. The latch didn't sit right. He'd been called in, spent less than an hour there, and left with a check and a polite thank you. Police spoke to him. Of course they did. And nothing about that conversation raised a single flag. He was cooperative. Calm. Answered everything without hesitation. Said he remembered Lisa. Nice woman, quiet. Said the door had been sticking, that he'd adjusted the frame, tested the lock, made sure it closed clean. When asked if he'd been back since, he shook his head. No reason to. Job was done. And that was it. No criminal record. No inconsistent statements. No motive. No evidence tying him to anything beyond a routine service call. In 1995, that wasn't just insufficient, it was invisible. So his name slid off the page. Filed. Forgotten. Buried under stronger leads that went nowhere. Until now. The DNA didn't care about context. It didn't care about alibis or impressions or how forgettable someone seemed in an interview room 23 years earlier. It simply matched what was there to what existed now. And what existed now was a database full of people who had made mistakes since then. Daniel Reeves had made one. Not in 1995. Not in Lisa's house. Years later. Smaller. Petty. The kind of crime that doesn't make headlines. A bar fight in 2008 that ended with an arrest. A mandatory DNA sample taken as part of the process. Logged. Stored. Ignored. Until the past came looking for it. When the hit came through, the room went quiet. Investigators who had spent careers watching dead cases stay dead suddenly had something alive in front of them, something breathing, something pointing, something impossible to ignore. Because if the DNA on that door belonged to Daniel Reeves, then one of two things had to be true. Either he had been in that house exactly when he said he was, and somehow left fresh biological evidence in a place that didn't make sense. Or he had been there again. Later, when Lisa Carter disappeared, the file was pulled apart again, this time with a different kind of attention, not the hopeful scrambling of a fresh investigation, but the cold, surgical focus of hindsight. Every line he had spoken was reread, every detail re-examined, not for what it said, but for what it avoided. And suddenly, things that once felt ordinary began to shift. The timeline. He said he'd finished the repair mid-afternoon, around 3:30 p.m., paid in cash. No receipt beyond a handwritten note that was never recovered. No one saw him leave. No one saw him arrive. Just his word. Back then, that was enough. Now, it wasn't, because Lisa was last confirmed alive at 5:10 p.m. that same day. A phone call with her sister. Brief. Uneventful. She mentioned the door had finally been fixed. Said she might go out later. Sounded normal. Unafraid. Alive. And somewhere in that 90-minute window between 3:30 and 5:10, something changed. Something entered that house. Or never left. Investigators went back to the neighborhood, not expecting memories. Those had faded, warped, softened by time, but looking for fragments. The kind people dismiss. The kind that didn't matter until they suddenly did. And one surfaced. A neighbor. Older now. Slower. But certain about one thing. She remembered a truck. Not unusual in itself. Contractors came and went. But this one lingered. Parked across the street longer than it needed to be. Engine off. No one inside, at least not that she saw. She remembered thinking it was odd, but not odd enough to act on. Not odd enough to remember clearly until someone asked the right question decades later. What kind of truck? A pause. White. Maybe. Or light-colored. Old. Daniel Reeves drove a white pickup in 1995. It wasn't proof. But it wasn't nothing anymore either. And then there was the door. That detail that never quite fit. Unlocked. No sign of forced entry. Back then, investigators leaned toward familiarity. Lisa knew whoever came in. She opened the door willingly. Trusted them. But what if the door didn't need to be opened? What if it had never been fully secured to begin with? Reeves had worked on that latch. Adjusted it. Tested it. What if he knew exactly how to make it appear fixed while leaving it vulnerable? Not broken. Not obviously tampered with. Just enough. Enough for someone who understood it to slip inside without force. Without noise. Without leaving the kind of damage police look for. The theory began to take shape, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility that refused to go away. A man enters a home under legitimate pretenses. He studies the layout, the routines, the vulnerabilities. He leaves. Or appears to. Then he comes back. And this time, no one is expecting him. The deeper they dug, the more the silence around Daniel Reeves started to feel less like innocence and more like absence. a lack of scrutiny that had protected him simply because no one had looked closely enough. His life after 1995 was unremarkable. Too unremarkable. Same town for a few years, then a move 2 counties over. Same kind of work. Same low profile. No long-term relationships. No sudden wealth. No dramatic changes. Just a steady, quiet existence that left almost no trace beyond basic records and the occasional mention in someone else's story. A man who lived in the background. A man who stayed there. Until the past pulled him forward. When investigators finally went to find him, they expected resistance, denial, shock, anger. Instead, they found something else. Daniel Reeves didn't run, didn't hide, didn't even seem surprised. He answered the door. And for a moment, just a moment, the scene echoed something from 23 years earlier. A door. An entry. A man standing on the threshold of a story that refused to stay buried. Mr. Reeves, one of the investigators said, voice steady, measured, carrying the weight of everything that had led to this moment. We need to talk to you about Lisa Carter. And in that instant, something flickered. Not panic, not guilt, not clearly, but recognition. Like hearing a name you thought the world had forgotten. And realizing it hadn't. Not completely. Not anymore. For a second too long, Daniel Reeves didn't say anything. Not confusion. Not denial. Just silence. The kind that stretches, thin and brittle, until it almost snaps. His eyes didn't widen, didn't dart, didn't betray panic the way investigators are trained to expect. They just held, fixed somewhere between the present and something older, something buried. Then he stepped back. Sure, he said. One word. Calm. Flat. Practiced, or maybe just empty. The house smelled faintly of dust and machine oil, like a place where things were repaired but never replaced. Tools lined the walls in quiet order. Nothing flashy. Nothing personal. No photographs in sight. No signs of a life shared with anyone else. It felt less like a home and more like a space someone occupied out of habit. Investigators had seen places like this before. Rooms that didn't tell stories. Rooms that kept them. They sat him down at a small table near the window. Afternoon light cut across the surface, catching on scratches in the wood, thin lines that looked random until you stared too long and started wondering how they got there. Do you remember a woman named Lisa Carter? One of them asked, even though they already knew the answer. Reeves nodded. Yeah, teacher. I fixed her door. Long time ago. No hesitation. No attempt to distance himself from the connection. If anything, he leaned into it, just enough to appear cooperative, just enough to control how much of the past he was willing to acknowledge. You spoke to police back then, the investigator continued. Guess so, Reeves said with a small shrug. Been a while. That was true. 23 years is long enough for details to blur, for memories to soften into something pliable. But it's also long enough for someone to build a version of events they can live with, one they can repeat without thinking. The investigators let a few seconds pass. Then they placed a folder on the table. Not opened. Just there. A presence. Your DNA was found inside her house, the other investigator said. And this time, something changed. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden movement, no raised voice. But the stillness cracked just slightly. A flicker behind the eyes. A tightening at the jaw. The kind of microreaction that doesn't mean anything on its own until it does. I worked on her door, Reeves said. Of course my DNA's there. He didn't ask how. Didn't ask where. Didn't question the science or the timing. He went straight to explanation. Straight to justification. And that, more than anything, shifted the air in the room. Inside the back door, the investigator clarified. On a surface you wouldn't normally touch during a standard repair. Reeves blinked once. Slow. Measured. I check my work, he said. Make sure things line up. Sometimes you gotta reach around, test the latch from different angles. It was a good answer. Technically plausible. Vague enough to cover uncertainty, specific enough to sound real. The kind of explanation that might have worked in 1995, when evidence was less precise and questions less pointed. But this wasn't 1995. Your DNA wasn't just present, the investigator continued, voice steady. It was recent, fresh, relative to the time we believe Lisa disappeared. That word hung there. Fresh. A quiet accusation wrapped in clinical language. Reeves leaned back slightly in his chair, arms crossing, not defensively, not aggressively, just enough to create distance. I don't know what to tell you, he said. I did the job. I left. That's it. And there it was. The line. Simple. Clean. Rehearsed over decades, whether consciously or not. I did the job. I left. Except now, that line had a fracture running through it. Because if he left, then why did the evidence suggest otherwise? The investigators didn't push immediately. Pressure, applied too quickly, can scatter a story before it has time to reveal its weak points. Instead, they shifted. Do you remember what time you finished? Afternoon, Reeves said. 3, maybe 3:30. Anyone see you leave? A pause. Don't remember. Did you go anywhere after? Another pause. Longer this time. Home, probably. Probably. A small word. An opening. In 1995, no one followed up on that. No GPS data. No digital trail. Just a man's memory and the assumption that if he had something to hide, it would show. But some people don't show. They wait. They adapt. They become exactly what the situation requires them to be. Invisible until they're not. Lisa spoke to her sister at 5:10 p.m., the investigator said. She was alive then. Reeves nodded slowly, like he was processing information that didn't concern him. Okay. That leaves a window, the investigator continued. A gap between when you say you left and when she was last heard from. Reeves didn't respond. He didn't need to. The implication was already there, filling the space between them. You ever go back to that house? The other investigator asked, casual in tone, sharp in intent. No. Too quick. Too clean. No hesitation this time. Just a flat, immediate answer that landed harder than any delay would have. And again, it wasn't proof. But it wasn't nothing. Because the case was no longer about what could be proven in a courtroom, not yet. It was about pressure, about patterns, about finding the moment where a carefully maintained version of the past begins to unravel under the weight of something real. The interview stretched on. Questions circling the same points from different angles. Times. Movements. Habits. Details so small they seemed meaningless until they overlapped, contradicted, or aligned a little too perfectly. Reeves stayed consistent. That was the unsettling part. No major slips. No obvious cracks. Just a man holding onto a story that had aged with him, hardened over time, worn smooth at the edges. But consistency can be its own kind of signal. Because real memories shift. They blur. They evolve. Rehearsed ones don't. After nearly 2 hours, the investigators stood. No arrest. Not yet. DNA placed him in the house, but it didn't place him there at the exact moment Lisa disappeared. It suggested. It implied. It pointed. But it didn't close the door. Not legally. As they stepped outside, the late-day sun felt sharper, harsher, like the world had tilted just enough to make everything slightly off. One of them glanced back at the house. Reeves was still inside, visible through the window, sitting exactly where they'd left him. Not moving, just watching. And in that stillness, there was something heavier than denial. Something quieter. A patience that didn't belong to someone caught off guard, but to someone who had been waiting a very long time to be asked the right questions. Back at the station, the case file didn't feel cold anymore. It felt active. Alive in a way that made every unanswered question sharper, louder, harder to ignore. Because now, the mystery wasn't just what happened to Lisa Carter. It was how someone could stand at the center of it for 23 years and never once be seen. The problem wasn't the DNA. Not anymore. That part was clear, clean, almost surgical in its precision. It had done its job, pulled a name out of the past and pinned it to a place, a moment, a possibility that refused to stay buried. The problem was everything around it. Because DNA doesn't tell a story. It doesn't explain intent. It doesn't draw timelines. It doesn't say why someone was there or what they did once they arrived. It just sits there, silent and absolute, forcing investigators to build something around it, something strong enough to hold in court, something real enough to break a man who had spent more than 2 decades living untouched by suspicion. And right now, they didn't have that. Not yet. Back at the station, Lisa Carter's file no longer sat closed and forgotten. It was spread out across a table like a map of a place no one had fully explored. Photographs, reports, handwritten notes from 1995, each one a fragment of a story that had never been finished. But now, those fragments were shifting. Details that once seemed small, incidental, irrelevant started to move. The glass of water on the counter, half full. Back then it meant nothing. A normal detail in a normal house. But now, it became a timestamp, a question. Did she pour it for herself? Or for someone else? No fingerprints were ever recovered from the glass, not usable ones, at least. Just smears. Overlaps. The kind of contamination that happens when a scene isn't recognized for what it is until it's already been disturbed. But the position of it that hadn't changed. Placed neatly. Not knocked over. Not abandoned mid-motion. Whoever had been there, things hadn't escalated immediately. There had been time. Time to stand. Time to talk. Time to exist in the same space without violence. Which meant one thing investigators kept circling back to, again and again. Lisa Carter hadn't been afraid. Not at first. They pulled the original photos of the back door, the same door Reeves claimed to have fixed. The alignment, the latch, the frame. In 1995, the report said it was functional, secure. Now, with fresh eyes and better tools, they saw something else. Subtle wear along the strike plate. Micro-scratches that didn't match standard use. Tiny inconsistencies in how the latch seated, not enough to fail, not enough to be obvious, but enough to suggest it could be manipulated. Not forced. Adjusted. Engineered. A door that looked locked but wasn't quite. The theory tightened. Reeves had access. Reeves had knowledge. Reeves had opportunity. But opportunity isn't action. And suspicion isn't proof. So they went deeper. They pulled everything they could on him, not just from 1995, but everything since. Employment records, addresses, minor offenses, people who knew him or thought they did. Patterns began to emerge. Not loud ones, not obvious, but consistent. Short-term jobs, no long-term attachments. A tendency to move just as routines began to settle. Not fleeing, not running, just drifting. And always within a certain radius. Never too far. Always close enough to remain part of the same quiet, interconnected world where people cross paths without really seeing each other. They started re-interviewing. Old neighbors first. People who had lived on Lisa's street back then. People who might remember something they didn't realize was important. Most didn't. Time had washed away specifics, leaving behind impressions that felt more like guesses than memories. But a few details surfaced. Small. Unsteady. But there. One neighbor remembered seeing Lisa talking to someone near the back of the house a few days before she disappeared. Not unusual. Not alarming. Just a conversation. But when asked to describe the man, she hesitated, then said something that made the room go quiet. He had a toolbox. Another remembered hearing a vehicle late in the evening the day Lisa vanished. Not loud. Not suspicious enough to call in. Just an engine starting, then fading into the distance. Time uncertain. Direction unclear. But present. And then there was the dog. A detail buried in an old report, barely noted. A neighbor's dog that barked constantly at strangers had been quiet that evening. No disturbance. No alert. Which meant whoever had been there wasn't perceived as a threat. Not by Lisa. Not by the dog. Familiar. Expected. Or, at least, not unwelcome. Back in the interrogation room, the second conversation with Reeves felt different. Not because the evidence had dramatically changed, but because the weight of it had shifted. He knew they had something now. And they knew he knew. You ever go back to adjust the door after the initial repair? the investigator asked, voice even, casual on the surface. No, Reeves said. Same answer. Same tone. Unmoved. You're sure about that? A slight tilt of his head. Yeah. The investigator slid a photograph across the table. Close up of the latch. The wear. The marks. Forensics suggests the door could be opened without a key, he said. If you knew exactly how it had been set. Reeves looked at the photo. Not long. Just enough. Then he pushed it back slightly. Doors were down, he said. Things shift. Doesn't mean anything. Again plausible. Again controlled. But now, each answer felt less like truth and more like positioning, careful, measured, designed to stay just outside the line of contradiction. You said you left around 3:30, the other investigator said. No one saw you leave. No one can confirm where you went after. Reeves shrugged. That was a long time ago. Yes, it was. A beat. And yet your DNA was fresh inside that house when she disappeared. Silence. Not empty this time. Heavy. Reeves leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, hands clasped. You're trying to make something out of nothing, he said. And there it was again. Nothing. That word. As if everything they had, the DNA, the timeline, the door, the fragments of memory, could be reduced to absence. But the case wasn't empty anymore. It was filling up. Slowly. Relentlessly. And pressure, applied long enough, doesn't always break something immediately. Sometimes, it just creates cracks you can't yet see. When the interview ended, Reeves stood the same way he had before. Calm. Composed. Untouched. But something had changed. Not in what he said. In what he didn't. Because now, every denial existed in the shadow of something tangible. Something that didn't forget. Didn't fade. Didn't rely on memory. DNA doesn't misremember. It doesn't get confused. It doesn't care how much time has passed. And for the first time in 23 years, the case wasn't asking what happened. It was asking how long someone could hold the line before it finally gave way. Pressure doesn't always explode. Sometimes it settles in, quiet and constant, pressing from all sides until something, somewhere, starts to shift. Not outwardly, not visibly, but internally, where control is thinner than it looks. Daniel Reeves went back to his routine. That, more than anything, unsettled the investigators. No sudden disappearance. No attempt to lawyer up aggressively. No visible panic. He showed up to work, took calls, fixed things, spoke to people the same way he always had, calm, minimal, forgettable. If he felt the net tightening, he didn't show it. But routine can be its own kind of tell. Because people who have nothing to hide don't usually rehearse normalcy this carefully. Surveillance began quietly. Unmarked vehicles. Rotating teams. No confrontation, no escalation, just observation. The kind that builds slowly, detail by detail, until a pattern either confirms itself or collapses. For the first few days, there was nothing. Reeves woke early, left at the same time, drove the same routes, took the same kinds of jobs, minor repairs, maintenance calls, small fixes no one else wanted. He spoke little, lingered nowhere, a man moving through spaces without ever settling into them. But then something small. So small it could have been missed. On the fourth day, he didn't go straight home. Instead, he drove out past the edge of town, not far, not fast, just enough to leave the rhythm of neighborhoods behind. The road narrowed, houses thinned, open land stretched out, dry and quiet under a sky that seemed too wide for anything to hide in. He turned onto a dirt path. No signage. No clear destination. Just a track worn by occasional use. The surveillance team kept their distance. Watched as his truck rolled to a stop near a patch of uneven ground. Nothing marked, nothing fenced, nothing that stood out unless you were already looking for something to stand out. Reeves got out. Stood there for a moment. Not moving. Just looking. At what, exactly, wasn't clear. Then, he walked a few steps forward. Hands in his pockets. Head slightly lowered. And for nearly 3 minutes he did nothing. No digging. No searching. No visible interaction with the ground, or anything around it. Just presence. Then he turned, got back into his truck, and drove away. If it had been anyone else, it might have meant nothing. A man stopping on a quiet road, taking a moment, clearing his head. But context changes everything. And in this case, context was a woman who vanished without a trace. A house with no signs of struggle. A door that didn't need to be forced. And a man whose DNA placed him exactly where he said he hadn't been. The location was logged, marked. And later that night, after Reeves was back home and still under watch, a separate team returned. Flashlights cut through the dark, sweeping over dry grass and uneven soil. The ground wasn't freshly disturbed, not obviously. No loose dirt, no shallow depressions that screamed recent digging. But time does strange things to Earth. It settles. It shifts. It hides what was once visible. They brought in ground-penetrating radar. Slow passes. Back and forth. And then a signal. Not definitive. Not clear. But different. A disruption beneath the surface. Roughly human-sized. Buried deeper than a shallow grave would suggest. The air changed. No one said it out loud. Not yet. Because hope in cases like this is dangerous. It builds fast. And it collapses faster. The next morning, a warrant was secured. By afternoon, the dig began. Careful. Measured. Layer by layer. The kind of excavation that treats the ground like evidence, not just a place to uncover it. Hours passed. Dirt gave way to more dirt. Nothing. Then something. A fragment. Not immediately recognizable.
Small. Pale.
Uneven. Work slowed.
Tools changed.
Brushes replaced shovels. And slowly, piece by piece, the shape began to form.
Bone.
Human.
Old.
Silence settled over the site, heavy and absolute. Because after 23 years, the case had finally found something it had never had before. A body. Or what was left of one. But even then, nothing was certain. Remains don't come with names. Not at first. They come with questions.
Age.
Gender.
Time.
Identity comes later, if it comes at all. The remains were transported under tight control, every fragment accounted for, every inch of soil around them preserved. Forensic teams moved with a precision that bordered on ritual because this wasn't just evidence anymore. This was a person. Possibly Lisa Carter. Possibly the answer. Or possibly just another layer in a story that refused to resolve cleanly. Back at the lab, the process began. Dental records. Bone analysis. DNA comparison. Each step slow, deliberate, unforgiving. And while that process moved forward, investigators returned to Reeves. This time, the conversation didn't open gently. "We found something," one of them said. Reeves didn't ask what. Didn't lean forward. Didn't react the way people usually do when confronted with a statement like that. He just waited. "A burial site," the investigator continued. "Out past County Road 17. A pause. Then, finally, a response. "So." One word. Flat. But it landed wrong. Too detached. Too removed from the gravity of what was being said. "You've been there recently," the other investigator added. Reeves shrugged. "People drive around. People don't usually stop in the middle of nowhere and stand in one place for 3 minutes." That flicker again.
Small.
Almost invisible. But there. "I go where I want," Reeves said. "That's not illegal." "No," the investigator replied. "But burying someone is." Silence. He didn't rise to it. Didn't challenge it. Didn't even deny it. He just sat there, expression unchanged, as if the accusation had been placed in front of him like an object he didn't feel the need to touch. Because denial requires engagement. And Reeves was doing something else. He was withholding it. "We're testing the remains," the investigator said. "If they're Lisa Carter's." He let the sentence hang. Didn't finish it. Didn't need to. Reeves looked down at his hands. For the first time, his stillness didn't feel controlled. It felt heavier, like something pressing back. "You're building a story," he said quietly. And that was the closest he had come to acknowledging anything. A story, not a lie, not a mistake, a construction, something being assembled around him. But the difference now is simple. The story wasn't coming from assumptions anymore. It was coming from the ground, from a place he had chosen to stand, a place that had stayed silent for 23 years. Until he went back to it, the lab didn't rush. They never do. Because once a body speaks, it doesn't get a second chance to be heard correctly. Every fragment, every fiber, every trace has to be processed with a kind of patience that feels almost cruel when answers are this close, close enough to touch, but still just out of reach. Days stretched. Then more days. Outside, the story was starting to leak. Not officially. Not in statements or press releases. But in the way small towns always know before they're told. Patrol cars seen near an empty stretch of land. Crime scene tape where there had never been any reason for it before. Questions asked too late, too quietly, too deliberately. Lisa Carter's name began to surface again. Not as a memory, as a possibility. And with it, something else followed.
Fear.
Because if the remains were hers, then this wasn't just a disappearance anymore. It was a murder that had lived among them for 23 years. And someone had carried it, silently, through all that time. Back in the lab, the bones told their version of the story. Partial skeleton. Female. Age range consistent. Time in the ground long. Long enough for soft tissue to vanish. Long enough for weather and soil to take what they always take. But not everything. Not the fractures. Not the damage. A break along the skull. Blunt force. Not clean. Not surgical. Jagged, uneven, consistent with something heavy and uncontrolled. The kind of strike that isn't meant to wound. It's meant to end. No defensive wounds could be confirmed. Too much time had passed, too much lost. But the absence of certain injuries raised its own quiet questions. No signs of prolonged struggle. No multiple impact points. Just one. Decisive.
Sudden.
And that aligned with everything else. The untouched house. The undisturbed furniture. The glass still standing on the counter. Whatever happened, it happened fast. Fast enough that Lisa Carter didn't have time to fight. Or didn't realize she needed to. DNA comparison moved forward. A sample from the remains against familial records. Lisa's sister had waited 23 years for something, anything, that could end the uncertainty. Now, she waited again, but this time the waiting felt different. Heavier. Because this time, the answer wouldn't just close a question. It would confirm something far worse. When the result came back, it didn't surprise anyone in the room. But it still changed everything.
Match.
Positive. Definitive. The remains found off County Road 17 were Lisa Carter. Missing no longer. Now something else. Something that carried a different weight, a different kind of finality. Homicide. The case shifted instantly. Legally. Structurally. Emotionally. This wasn't about finding her anymore. It was about proving who had taken her life. In a way that would hold. In a way that couldn't be explained away. In a way that would survive not just suspicion but scrutiny. And that's where things became harder. Because even now, even with a body, even with DNA, even with a suspect standing in the center of it all, there was still a gap. A space between presence and proof. Reeves' DNA placed him inside the house. The burial site connected him circumstantially. The timeline narrowed around him like a tightening frame. But none of it, on its own, showed the act. Didn't show the moment. Didn't show him striking that blow. And in court, that moment matters. More than anything else. Investigators returned to the house. Lisa's house. Now empty. Quiet. Changed by time, but still holding its shape, its structure, its memory in the walls. They walked it again, not as a missing person scene, but as a crime scene that had finally revealed what it had been all along. The kitchen. The counter. That glass. Still preserved in photographs, now re-examined with new context. Two people had likely been standing there, facing each other. Close enough for conversation. Close enough for trust. And then something shifted. A word. A movement. A realization that came too late. They mapped it out. Positions. Angles. Possibilities. If the blow came from the front, she would have seen him. If it came from behind, she would have had to turn or not expect it at all. No signs of struggle suggested something else. Proximity without alarm, which meant the most dangerous detail of all. She didn't see it coming. Back in interrogation, the tone changed. No more circling. No more soft entries. They laid it out. We identified the remains, the investigator said. Reeves didn't ask who. Didn't need to. It's Lisa Carter. A pause. Not long, but real. And for the first time, something in his posture shifted. Not dramatically, not enough to call it a break, but enough to register as weight. As impact. You're sure? He asked. It was the first question he had asked. The first time he had reached toward the information instead of pushing it away. Yes. Silence followed. Different this time. Less controlled. More occupied. We also know how she died, the investigator continued. Blunt force trauma to the head. Reeves looked up. Slowly. Met their eyes. And held it. No denial. No outrage. Just a long, steady look that felt less like innocence and more like calculation, like something behind it was measuring, adjusting, recalibrating. You keep saying we know, he said quietly. But you don't. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't even defensive. It was precise. Like he was drawing a line. And for the first time, it felt like he wasn't just reacting. He was engaging. You were in that house, the investigator said. Your DNA proves that. I fixed the door. Your DNA was fresh. You think that means I killed her? Another pause. Then softer. That's not proof. And he was right. That was the problem. Everything pointed. Everything aligned. Everything built toward one conclusion. But the case still needed something more. Something undeniable. Something that didn't rely on interpretation. Because Reeves wasn't breaking. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't even denying in the way guilty people often do. He was doing something far more difficult to dismantle. He was holding the line between suspicion and certainty. And as long as that line existed, he could stand behind it. Outside, the town had already crossed that line. For them, the story had shifted completely. Lisa Carter wasn't missing. She had been taken. And the man who might have done it had lived among them, unseen, untouched, for over 2 decades. But inside the case, inside the investigation, inside the slow, grinding process of turning truth into proof, it wasn't enough to believe. They had to show it, piece by piece, moment by moment, until there was nowhere left for him to stand, except in the exact place he had tried to leave behind. The line was still there.
Thin.
Invisible to anyone outside the room, but unmistakable to those trying to cross it. On one side, suspicion, heavy and mounting, built from DNA, timelines, behavior, a burial site that shouldn't exist. On the other, proof, the kind that survives a courtroom, the kind that doesn't bend under pressure or doubt. Daniel Reeves stood exactly on that line. And he knew it. That was the part that made everything harder. Because most people, when confronted with this much weight, start to slip. They contradict themselves. They reach too far. They overexplain. They panic in small, revealing ways that investigators are trained to catch. Reeves didn't. He adjusted. Each interview sharpened him. Not more defensive, more precise. He stopped offering extra details. Stopped filling silence. He let questions land and answered only what was asked. Nothing more, nothing less. His words became shorter.
Cleaner.
Harder to pull apart. It wasn't fear. It was control. And control like that doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from time. From living with something long enough that it stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like something manageable. But time cuts both ways. Because while Reeves had spent 23 years shaping his version of the past, investigators now had the same time to dismantle it. They went back to the burial site. Not for confirmation that part was done, but for detail. The kind that doesn't show itself until you already know what you're looking at. The grave wasn't rushed. That was the first thing. Depth placement, the way the soil had been packed, it suggested effort. Not panic. Not a hurried attempt to hide something quickly. This had been deliberate, measured, almost methodical, which raised a question that didn't have an easy answer. How does someone go from a sudden, violent act to something this controlled? Because the evidence pointed to two different moments. The first, fast, impulsive, a single blow that ended a life in seconds. The second, slower, deliberate, requiring time, tools, and the ability to remain composed. Something had changed between those 2 points. Or something had already been there. They expanded the search area. Careful sweeps beyond the immediate site. And then another detail. Small. Easy to miss. A rusted fragment, half buried, just outside the main dig zone. Metal. Curved. Worn down by time, but still recognizable in shape. Part of a tool. Not complete, but enough. Forensics cleaned it, analyzed it, compared it to known tool patterns. Hammer head. Old. Common. The kind of thing a maintenance contractor might carry without a second thought. No DNA. Too degraded. Too exposed. But its presence, its proximity, its alignment with the fracture on Lisa's skull. It didn't prove anything on its own, but it added weight. More pieces, all pointing in the same direction. Back at Reeves' property, investigators executed a search warrant. This time, not for conversation. For evidence. Drawers opened. Cabinets emptied. Tools cataloged, bagged, logged. Every surface treated as a potential source of something overlooked, something missed. Years had passed. Too many in some ways. But people don't always get rid of everything. Sometimes they keep things without realizing why. Or they forget what matters. Or they believe, deep down, that no one will ever come looking. Reeves stood outside as the search unfolded. Watching. Not interfering. Not asking questions. Just present. Like he had been at that field. Like he had been in that interview room. Always there. Always still. One of the investigators stepped out, holding a worn toolbox. Old. Scratched. Functional. Inside, standard equipment. Wrenches. Screwdrivers. A few older pieces that hadn't been replaced in years. And then a gap. An empty slot where something had once been. Missing a hammer? The investigator asked, almost casually. Reeves glanced at the box. Then back up. Things get lost, he said. Of course they do. Over 23 years. Objects disappear. Tools get replaced. Pieces go missing. It was a reasonable answer. But reasonable wasn't the same as convincing anymore. They brought him back in. Not for a formal interrogation this time. For pressure. Sustained. Layered. Relentless. They laid out everything. The DNA. The timeline. The burial site. The tool fragment. The inconsistencies. Not as accusations. As facts. Side by side. Building a picture that didn't need to shout to be understood. You were there, the investigator said. Reeves didn't respond. You had the means. Silence. You had access. Nothing. And now we have her. That landed. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But something in the air shifted. Subtle. Like a structure under strain. You can keep saying nothing, the investigator continued. You can keep holding that line. But it's getting thinner. Reeves exhaled slowly. Looked down. Then up again. And for the first time, there was something different in his eyes. Not fear. Not exactly. Something closer to recognition. Like he could see the shape of what was coming. You don't know what happened in that house, he said. Not a denial. Not anymore. A statement. Careful. Measured. You're right, the investigator replied. So tell us. A long pause. Longer than any before it. Time stretching, tightening, waiting for something to break. Reeves leaned back slightly, eyes drifting for just a second. Not away, not escaping, but searching somewhere internal, somewhere locked behind years of silence. Then he shook his head. Once. Small. Controlled. No. And just like that, the line held. Still there. Still intact. But now, it wasn't invisible anymore. It was visible to everyone in the room. And more importantly, it was weakening. Because every piece they added didn't just build the case. It reduced his space, step by step,
detail by detail,
until eventually there would be nowhere left to stand, except inside the truth he had avoided for 23 years. The line didn't break. Not yet. But it bent. And sometimes that's the moment everything starts to change, not with a confession, not with a collapse, but with the smallest shift in how someone carries the weight of what's closing in. Daniel Reeves stopped pretending this was routine. He still showed up, still moved through his days with that same quiet rhythm. But the edges were different now.
sharper, tighter.
The pauses between actions lasted a fraction longer. His eyes lingered where they hadn't before, on passing patrol cars, on unfamiliar vehicles parked too long on the same stretch of road. He wasn't panicking. He was tracking. And that told investigators something important. He knew this wasn't going away. The surveillance logs grew thicker. Pages of small, seemingly insignificant details that, together, formed something more revealing than any single piece of evidence.
Times, routes, stops,
Repetitions, deviations, and then, finally, a break in pattern. Late evening. Not part of his usual schedule. Reeves left his house after dark. No work call logged. No client address tied to the movement. Just a drive, slow at first, then more direct, more intentional, as if following a path already decided long before the engine turned over. The team followed at a distance. Headlights kept low, gaps maintained. He didn't go to the field. Not this time. He went somewhere else. An older part of town. Fewer lights. Narrower streets. Houses closer together but quieter. The kind of quiet that comes from people who've lived in the same place long enough to stop noticing each other. He pulled over. Engine idling.
Didn't get out immediately. Just sat there.
Watching. The house in front of him wasn't unfamiliar. Not to the investigators. Lisa Carter's house. Empty for years now. Sold. Resold. Lived in by others who had no connection to what happened inside it. No memory of the silence that followed. No awareness of the way the walls had once held a story no one could finish. Reeves killed the engine. Stepped out. And for a moment, everything slowed. No sudden movement. No forced entry. No attempt to hide. He just stood on the sidewalk, looking at the house like someone revisiting a place that still belonged to him in ways no one else could see. Then he moved. Up the path. To the door. The same door. The one he said he fixed. The one that didn't need to be forced. His hand hovered near the handle. Didn't touch it. Just hovered. As if the memory of it was enough. Inside the surveillance vehicle, no one spoke. Because whatever this was, it wasn't random. And it wasn't meaningless. Reeves lowered his hand. Stepped back. Exhaled. And then, almost as quickly as he had arrived, he turned and walked away. Got back into his truck. Drove off. No entry. No contact. Just presence. Again. But this time it was different. Because this wasn't a field in the middle of nowhere. This was the origin point. The place where everything started. Or ended. Depending on how you looked at it. The next morning, the pressure increased. Not in volume. In precision. They brought him in again. No preamble. No easing into it. You went back, the investigator said. Reeves didn't pretend not to understand. Drove around, he replied. You stood at her door. A pause. Then, didn't go in. Not a denial. A correction.
Small.
But deliberate. You didn't need to, the investigator said. You already know what's inside. Silence. You've been there before. Nothing. Not just to fix it. Reeves leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. Not in anger, but in focus, like he was choosing his next words more carefully than ever. You're watching me now? He asked. Yes. Another pause. He nodded once.
Slow. Processing.
Accepting. That mattered. Because acceptance changes behavior. And behavior, under pressure, reveals things words don't. You keep going back, the investigator continued. The field. The house. Places tied to her. Reeves didn't respond. But he didn't look away either. You're not doing that for no reason. A long silence settled in. He broke it. Not with a denial. With something else. Ever fix something, he said quietly, and it doesn't stay fixed. The investigator didn't answer. Didn't interrupt. Reeves looked down at his hands again. Flexed his fingers slightly. You think you got it right, he continued. You leave. And then later something's off. You go back. Check it. Adjust it. His voice was steady. But the words weren't about doors anymore. Sometimes it takes more than once. The room didn't move. Didn't breathe. Because this was the closest he had come. Not to a confession. But to a framework. A way of thinking. A pattern. You went back that day, the investigator said. Not a question. A statement. Reeves didn't confirm it. Didn't deny it. He just sat there. And that silence said more than anything he had spoken so far. You didn't leave at 3:30, the investigator pressed. You came back. Nothing. You used the door you fixed. Still nothing. You knew she'd open it. Or you didn't need her to. Reeves' jaw tightened. Barely. But enough. And something went wrong. That landed. Different from the rest. Because now, the narrative wasn't just about presence. It was about loss of control. You didn't plan to kill her, the investigator continued. But you did. The air shifted. Again. He inhaled. Slow. Held it. Then let it out. You don't know that, he said. And there it was. Not I didn't. Not that's not true. Just. You don't know. The line didn't break. But it bent further. And now, for the first time, it wasn't just investigators pushing against it. Reeves was leaning on it from the other side, testing how much it could still hold. Because after 23 years of silence, the past wasn't just catching up. It was starting to speak. And he was finally listening. Once the line bends, it never returns to what it was. It holds, maybe, for a while. But something inside it has already shifted, structure weakened, pressure redistributed, cracks spreading in places no one can see yet. Daniel Reeves wasn't the same man who first opened his door to investigators. Not outwardly. Outwardly, he still looked controlled. Still spoke in measured tones. Still chose his words like someone placing pieces on a board, careful not to overcommit, careful not to expose more than necessary. But underneath that control, something was moving, and investigators could feel it. They changed strategy. Not louder, not more aggressive, more personal, because facts had done what they could. Now it was about time, about memory, about forcing the past into the present in a way that couldn't be dismissed as theory or construction. They brought in photographs, not evidence photos, not the burial site. Something else. Lisa Carter, alive, standing in a classroom, smiling at something outside the frame, caught mid-laugh in another, head tilted slightly back, unaware of the camera, unaware of everything that would follow. They placed the photos in front of him. Reeves didn't touch them, but he looked. And this time he didn't look away quickly. His eyes stayed on the image longer than they had stayed on anything else in the room. Seconds passed. Then more. You remember her, the investigator said quietly. Not a question. A fact. Reeves exhaled. Slow. Yeah. Barely above a whisper. Another shift. Small. But undeniable. She trusted you, the investigator continued. No response. You were supposed to fix something. Make her feel safe. His fingers moved slightly on the table. Not fidgeting. Just reacting. You went back, the investigator said. And she let you in. Silence. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was full. Of something pressing upward. You stood in that kitchen, the investigator went on. Right where she poured that glass of water. Reeves' eyes flicked. Not to the investigator. Not away. Just somewhere else. Inside. You talked. Nothing. About what? Still nothing. But the silence had changed shape. It wasn't a wall anymore. It was a gap. And gaps can be widened. You didn't go there to kill her, the investigator said again, softer this time. Something happened. Reeves swallowed. Subtle. But visible. You got angry. A pause. Or she did. Another pause. And then it was over. The room felt tighter now. Closer. Like the space itself was compressing around that moment, forcing it into focus. Reeves leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, hands clasped together. His voice, when it came, was lower than before. Quieter. You keep saying it like you were there. Not denial. Not rejection. Just distance. You weren't. The investigator nodded once. You're right, he said. We weren't. A beat. But you were. Silence again. He held it. Held it longer than before. But holding something doesn't mean it isn't slipping. 23 years, the investigator continued. That's a long time to carry something like that. Reeves' jaw tightened. You buried her, he said. You went back to that field. You stood over that spot. Nothing. You came back to the house. Still nothing. You don't do that for no reason. Reeves closed his eyes for a second. Just one. But it was enough. Because when he opened them again, something had changed. Not gone. Not broken. But exposed. A layer thinner than before. You ever think, he said slowly, that maybe things don't happen the way you think they do? The investigator didn't interrupt. Maybe you don't see everything, Reeves continued. Maybe you fill in the blanks. He looked down at the photographs again. At Lisa. Alive. Frozen in a moment that had never ended for anyone except her. You make it simple, he said. Like there's a straight line from one thing to the next. His fingers tightened slightly. But it's not like that. A long pause. Then, not always. That was it. That was the closest he had come to opening the door. Not fully. Not even halfway. But enough to see something on the other side. Something messy. Something not as clean as a planned act. Not as clear as a simple narrative. Something fractured. You went back, the investigator said again, but this time the words carried less accusation, more weight. Why? Reeves didn't answer, but he didn't deflect either. He just sat there, breathing, thinking, holding something in place that no longer wanted to stay there. Was she already dead? The investigator asked. Nothing. Or did it happen while you were there? A flicker. Did she say something? Silence. Did you? Reeves' hands shifted, unclasped, then clasped again. You don't understand, he said quietly. And that was new, because for the first time, he wasn't talking about the evidence. He was talking about the moment. The one place the case still couldn't fully reach. Help me understand, the investigator said. Soft. Steady. No pressure in the tone. Just an opening. And for a second, a single, fragile second, it looked like Reeves might take it. His mouth parted slightly. A breath drawn in. Words forming somewhere behind it. Then, he stopped. Closed his mouth. Shook his head. And just like that, the opening closed. Not slammed. Not violently. Just sealed again. But not the same way. Because now everyone in the room knew what was behind it. Not certainty. Not a clean story. But something real. Something he had almost said. And almost was enough. Because once a truth gets that close to the surface, it doesn't go back down quietly. It waits, presses, builds, until the next time the line bends, and maybe, finally breaks. The room felt heavier after that silence. Not because anything had changed outwardly, but because something inside had shifted, a subtle tension that wasn't there before. Investigators could sense it in the way Reeves' hands moved slightly, in the way his shoulders stiffened, in the pause before he answered the simplest questions. He was still calm, still controlled, but the armor had tiny cracks, tiny glimpses of what lay beneath. They returned to the field, the site where Lisa Carter had been found. Dry, sun-baked earth stretched out, ordinary to anyone who hadn't lived this story for decades. But for those who had, every inch was loaded with meaning. Every shadow, every uneven patch of dirt spoke. And now, with DNA confirming identity, with Reeves' presence traced there repeatedly, the field was no longer just dirt and weeds. It was a witness. Silent. Patient. Waiting. Investigators retraced the path Reeves had taken, noting every turn, every stop, every deviation from what had once seemed like routine. Each detail, once insignificant, now connected in a web that slowly, impossibly, pointed towards something deliberate. The site told them about timing, about how long someone had lingered, about the precision of placement, the careful lowering of a body into a grave that was deeper than shallow, yet hidden enough for years to pass without discovery. Back at the station, Reeves was brought in once more. This time, the approach shifted entirely. No accusations, no pressing, no aggressive corners. Instead, they laid out the narrative already emerging from the evidence, not to trap him, not to provoke, but to see what he would do with it. "We know where she was," one investigator said softly. "We know how she was moved. We know when you were there." Reeves remained still, eyes steady, hands resting flat on the table, breathing measured. Nothing betrayed surprise. Nothing betrayed guilt. Not yet. "You were in the house that night," the investigator continued. "Your DNA proves it. You returned to the field after that. You were alone. No witnesses. No distractions. That much we can confirm." A beat. A pause. Reeves exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly. "I fixed the door," he said again. But this time, there was weight in it. Not just a statement of fact, not just an attempt at control. Something else lingered underneath, an acknowledgement that the past wasn't going to stay buried anymore. "Fixing the door doesn't explain the rest," the investigator said. "It doesn't explain the presence of her body, the way it was found, the timeline that points directly to you." Reeves tilted his head slightly, eyes on the floor first, then slowly lifting to meet theirs. "Things don't always happen the way people think they do," he said softly. The words weren't defiance this time. They were a pause in the narrative, a suggestion that even he understood the gravity of what was being pieced together, yet couldn't, or wouldn't, tell the whole story. Investigators pressed on, walking him through every detail: the burial, the time in the house, the blow to the skull, the subtle marks in the latch, the field, the toolbox fragment. Layer by layer, all circumstantial, all connected, all pointing toward one uncomfortable truth. The story he carried for 23 years had cracks. And those cracks were wide enough for the past to leak through. He didn't flinch, didn't break, didn't protest. Just observed, calculated, measured. Each piece of the puzzle laid before him, and yet, not a single reaction betrayed anything definitive. Not remorse. Not fear. Not denial. Only awareness. "You've gone back before," the investigator said. "To the house. To the field. To the places she was last alive. You went there because something drew you back. You can't undo that, but you can tell us why." Reeves' fingers drummed lightly on the table. His lips pressed together. The room was still. Taut. Like the moment before a storm breaks. He opened his mouth, then closed it. A small shake of the head. One wordless motion that spoke louder than any confession could. Because the line, that thin, invisible line between guilt and proof, had bent too far. And now he was on the edge. Waiting. Watching. Calculating. The investigators could feel it. Everyone could. "You don't want to say it," the investigator continued. "Not yet. That's fine. But every time you stay silent, every time you hold back, it gives us more. Every pause, every hesitation, every small gesture tells a story." Reeves' eyes flicked. Just once. A micro-movement, nearly invisible. Enough to confirm the tension was mutual, that the line had shifted, and now both sides were feeling the pull. The room held its breath. And in that heavy, unspoken silence, the past and present collided. A man who had lived with his secret for more than 2 decades, and a story that refused to let him carry it alone any longer. Because the field, the house, the burial, they were all witnesses. And now, with every piece of evidence laid bare, with every subtle motion recorded, with every pause noted, the case was no longer just a search for proof. It had become a reckoning, a waiting, for the moment when the line would finally snap, when silence would no longer be enough. And the truth, raw, inevitable, undeniable, would finally step into the light. The final hours stretched like a wire pulled taut. Every second measured, deliberate, unrelenting. Investigators moved quietly, methodically, the weight of 23 years pressing down with them. Every detail, every fragment of evidence, every witness recollection had led here, and still the moment felt impossibly fragile. One misstep, one poorly phrased question, and the line, already bent, already fraying, could slip entirely, and the story would retreat back into shadows. Reeves was brought in again. He entered the room slowly, not hurried, not hesitant, but carrying the same invisible load he always had. No fidgeting, no nervous glance, just measured steps, eyes scanning the room, a mind clearly weighing every option. He had lived with this for decades. He knew what each pause, each gaze, each word from the investigators could do. And now, that knowledge was a weapon of its own. "You know why you're here," one of the investigators said. Not a question. A statement. Firm. Heavy. Inescapable. Reeves didn't respond immediately. Just lowered himself into the chair with a subtle, almost imperceptible exhale, as if he were bracing himself against something that had waited all this time to meet him. 23 years, the investigator continued. Her family has waited. The community has waited. The truth has waited. And now, everything we've pieced together points to you. For a moment, the room held only the sound of breathing. Not loud, not exaggerated, just the measured, steady rhythm of a man and the investigators staring across a table at each other. "DNA," the investigator said. "Your presence inside her home. The field where she was buried. The timeline. The tool fragment. Everything." Reeves' eyes flicked. A micro-expression, almost invisible, yet enough to register in the sharp eyes of seasoned investigators. Not fear. Not denial. Recognition. Acceptance. Not of guilt, but of inevitability. "You've held the line for a long time," the investigator said, voice low, steady. "But the line is bending. And bending too far. You can keep holding it, or you can let the truth in. The choice is yours." Reeves leaned back slightly, eyes scanning the ceiling, then back at the table. His fingers flexed once, twice, unclasping and clasping. Then, quietly, almost under his breath, he said, "It's all wrong the way people see it." The investigator nodded. "Maybe. But the evidence doesn't lie. The evidence tells us what happened, step by step. And now it's your move." A long pause. Longer than any before. It wasn't emptiness. It was full of tension, the pressure of decades, the weight of inevitability pressing into every muscle, every thought. Reeves' breathing slowed, measured, deliberate. He knew. He had always known this day could come. And yet, nothing had prepared him for the way it felt to finally face it. His voice came next, low, deliberate, controlled. "I didn't mean for it to happen." The room shifted imperceptibly. Not triumph, not relief, just the subtle, almost imperceptible acknowledgement that the line had finally begun to break. That the careful, calculated walls he had built over 23 years were starting to crack. Investigators leaned in. "Then tell us," one said softly. "Tell us everything. From the beginning. From the moment you fixed that door, to the field, to her." Reeves' eyes focused now. Not on them, not even on the evidence, but on the story itself, the weight of it, the inevitability. He drew in a slow breath. And then, for the first time in more than 2 decades, the words began to flow. The tale was fragmented, jagged, uneven, like a fracture in time itself. Every detail precise and distorted at once. The door, the glass, the conversation that had seemed trivial at the time. The moment anger flared, decisions twisted, control slipped. The suddenness of violence, the calculated method of concealment. The field, the burial. Every choice, every misstep, every second that had stretched into decades. As he spoke, the room absorbed it all. The investigators wrote, recorded, mapped, cataloged. The story fell into place imperfectly but undeniably. The pieces that had been missing for 23 years finally aligned, chaotic, brutal, human. When he finished, silence lingered. Heavy, complete. The line had finally broken, and what remained was clarity. Not neat, not clean, not easily reconciled, but undeniable. Outside, the town held its breath. The past, long buried, now laid bare. The missing finally accounted for. The suspect, no longer just a shadow, revealed fully. And somewhere in that silence, the community began to feel it. Closure, fragile and incomplete, but real. The cold case of Texas 1995 had finally reached its reckoning. 23 years of waiting, of questions unanswered, of stories half told, now ended. Not with simplicity, not with comfort, but with truth. And truth, in its rawest form, always carries a weight that no one forgets. Even after the confession, the room didn't relax. Silence hung heavier now than before, filled not with uncertainty, but with the gravity of what had finally been revealed. Reeves sat back, eyes distant, staring at a point beyond the walls, as if replaying every moment in that house, every footstep in the field, every choice that had led here. His voice had told the story, but his presence still carried the weight of 23 years of secrets. The investigators didn't rush him. They let the words settle, let the fragments of memory linger, letting him live with each one in real time. Each pause, each slight twitch of the hand, each unspoken detail told as much as his words. The evidence, DNA, the tool fragment, the burial site, now intertwined seamlessly with the narrative he had revealed. For the first time, the puzzle wasn't scattered. It was whole. Outside, the wind whispered across the field where Lisa Carter had been found. The grass swayed gently, hiding the scars of the earth, the shallow dips where decades of secrecy had rested. But the ground could no longer keep the story. Every inch had been mapped, measured, catalogued, analyzed. The field was no longer just a place. It was a witness, silent no more. Reeves' voice broke the room's quiet again, softer now, tinged with the weight of memory and remorse. "I thought I could fix it," he murmured. "I thought if I buried it, if I controlled the story, it would stop." The investigator nodded slowly. But it didn't stop. And it never could. Some truths aren't meant to be hidden. Some stories find a way to surface, no matter how carefully you bury them. He shifted slightly, the faintest tremor in his hands betraying a tension he had spent years concealing. 23 years, he said, almost to himself. 23 years of silence, of pretending, of living with it. His gaze dropped to the table. And for what? So no one would know. "Because it was wrong," the investigator replied. "And now we know. Now it's out. The story's complete. Lisa has her truth back. Her family has answers. And the line you held for so long has finally snapped." Reeves exhaled slowly, a deep, shuddering breath, as if decades of pressure were finally releasing. The tension that had coiled through every movement, every measured word, every shadow of his silence was loosening.
Not gone.
Not forgiven. Not absolved. But no longer in complete control of him. For the first time, he looked directly at them. Eyes no longer distant. Eyes that had carried the weight of secrets for decades, finally seeing what had always been unavoidable. The past cannot be rewritten. The line, once invisible and unyielding, had been crossed. The truth, unrelenting and raw, now stood fully exposed. The investigation wasn't over. Courtrooms, legal procedures, testimonies, all awaited. But the cold case, the 23-year-old shadow over the community, the unanswered questions, the lingering dread, was solved. DNA had illuminated the path. Persistence had unveiled the hidden. And a suspect, long insulated by time and silence, had finally confronted the story he had lived inside for decades. Outside, in the field, the wind carried a quiet finality. The grass swayed gently, indifferent to human timelines, yet somehow bearing witness to them. The earth had held a secret for more than 2 decades, and now it had spoken. And though the community could never forget the horror of what had happened, the truth had arrived. The line had broken, the silence had ended, and the story, brutal, messy, human, had found its voice. 23 years of waiting, of searching, of cold nights haunted by questions that had no answers had finally ended. And in that ending was something that had been impossible all along. The reckoning, slow and deliberate, for a crime long buried, now exposed, now understood, now undeniable. The cold case of Texas 1995 had been solved. Not cleanly, not without pain, not without lingering echoes, but solved. And the echoes, now, would never be silent again. The town was quiet the morning after. Streets that had once seemed ordinary now carried a different weight. Every neighbor, every passerby, every familiar corner held echoes of a story that had lingered unseen for more than 2 decades. Lisa Carter's name floated in conversations, whispered at first, then spoken aloud, tentative but undeniable. The cold case that had haunted the community for 23 years had finally been solved, and the relief was tangible, even in its unease. Her family moved carefully through the day, touching objects she had once cherished, revisiting photographs, old letters, and the small items that had survived the long absence. Every detail mattered. Every memory was a proof of existence, a counterbalance to the silence that had stretched for years. And in that painstaking reconstruction of the past, the community felt both closure and the raw sting of loss, knowing what had been taken and what could never be restored. Reeves, meanwhile, was escorted through the same streets, under quiet surveillance, every step heavy with the inevitability of what awaited. His demeanor was unchanged outwardly, calm, controlled, measured, but inside, the armor of years of secrecy had thinned. For the first time, he was walking in a world that knew. The past had caught up, and there was no longer space to hide behind shadows or silence. Every glance from a passerby, every whisper, carried an unspoken recognition. The weight of 23 years pressed down, unrelenting, as he moved toward the courthouse, toward accountability. Investigators reflected on the precision it had taken to finally bring this case to light. DNA evidence, careful documentation, surveillance, and painstaking interviews had all converged to form a complete picture, a story long buried but now undeniable. It was a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply hidden, finds a way to surface. That even the most meticulous efforts to erase a moment cannot withstand persistence, patience, and scrutiny. In the courtroom, Reeves' silence shifted again. Not the defiance of the early interviews. Not the measured distance of someone playing a calculated game. This was the quiet of realization. The awareness that no longer could he bend the narrative to his favor. Every piece of evidence, every witness, every recollection converged into a net from which there was no escape. And yet, even as the gavel's weight loomed, there was a strange serenity in finally confronting the truth. Outside, the community gathered, quietly, collectively processing what had been unresolved for decades. Conversations drifted between grief, relief, and lingering shock. The cold case, once a phantom of fear and uncertainty, had been rendered tangible. And with that tangibility came a new kind of reflection, the fragility of safety, the unseen threads that connect us, the way a single act can ripple across years and lives. Reeves' fate would now be determined by law, yet the story itself had already marked him. The years of silence, concealment, and careful navigation of shadows had ended. He would live with the consequences, but more importantly, the past, long unspoken, long buried, had finally spoken. And the community, scarred but awakened, could begin to rebuild its understanding of safety, trust, and the shadows that linger long after the initial crime. Even in the quiet, even after the legal processes had begun, the story remained vivid. The field where Lisa Carter had been found, the house where she had last been seen, the evidence that had been painstakingly collected, all remained as silent witnesses. They were reminders that truth has a persistence all its own, that secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of resurfacing. that the echoes of a cold case ripple far beyond the moment of discovery, touching lives, reshaping communities, and haunting those who carried them. And as the sun set over Texas, painting the horizon in gold and shadow, there was a sense of finality, but also a lingering unease. 23 years of silence had ended, the cold case had been solved, the suspect exposed, and yet the echoes of what had been lost would never entirely fade. They would remain, subtle but persistent, in conversations, in memories, in the quiet spaces between everyday life. A reminder that even solved cold cases leave their mark, not only on the evidence, not only on the law, but on the hearts and minds of everyone who waited for the truth to emerge. The story had reached its conclusion, but its presence would endure. In the field, in the house, in the community, and in Reeves himself, the weight of history, the permanence of choices, and the inescapable resonance of a life ended far too soon. The cold case of Texas 1995 was solved, and in its resolution lay both closure and a haunting reminder. Truth, once found, cannot be unlearned, and the shadows it leaves behind are as real as the light it finally reveals. The night settled over the town like a heavy curtain, wrapping streets and homes in a quiet that felt almost unnatural after decades of suspicion and whispers. Yet the darkness didn't carry comfort. It carried reflection, an almost tactile reminder of what had been lost and what had been uncovered. For the families, for the investigators, and for the community, this was a night to confront the aftermath, the emotional debris left in the wake of a truth that had finally emerged. Reeves sat in his cell, alone with the weight of the confession he had delivered. Silence surrounded him, broken only by the distant hum of machinery and the occasional footstep echoing down the corridor. The control he had wielded for 23 years, controlling access, narrative, perception, was gone. Now he had only his own thoughts, loops of memory, decisions made, and the inevitability that awaited him in the courtroom. The armor of meticulous calm had cracked further, leaving only the man beneath, tired, aware, and irrevocably exposed. Meanwhile, the field where Lisa Carter's body had lain remained undisturbed, but alive in memory. Investigators returned occasionally, not to uncover more evidence that had been completed, but to pay a quiet respect to the space that had borne witness for decades. Each blade of grass, each patch of dirt, seemed to hold the echoes of her last moments, the careful concealment, the patient weight of the earth to keep it secret. Now, however, the witness had spoken, and those echoes carried a different resonance, a reminder of both horror and closure. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The community, journalists, and family members filled the seats, all drawn by a story that had lingered too long in shadow. When Reeves entered, the room shifted subtly, a collective inhale of anticipation and unease. He carried himself with the same measured rhythm, but now his gaze was heavier, aware of eyes tracking him, of histories colliding, of consequences impossible to evade. The trial would be meticulous, deliberate. Evidence laid out piece by piece, DNA linking him definitively to the scene, witness accounts corroborating timelines, the physical tools of the crime accounted for. Each moment, each fact, each testimony reinforced the chain of events that had remained hidden for so long. Yet even as legal procedures unfolded, the emotional truth, the human cost, reverberated through the room more powerfully than any forensic report. Outside, the town felt the ripples of closure. Conversations spoke her name aloud, where for years it had been whispered. Memories were recounted, photographs shared, recollections of a life interrupted yet preserved in fragments. The collective memory of a community had been altered, grief sharpened, relief tempered by reflection, a realization that while justice might be served, the emptiness left by years of waiting could never be fully erased. Reeves, isolated yet surrounded by the inevitability of law, understood the permanence of what had transpired. The cold case had been solved, but resolution was not absolution. Every decision he had made, every choice he had buried alongside his victim, now carried consequences as tangible as the walls enclosing him. The careful equilibrium of his past, maintained for decades, had collapsed under the pressure of truth and persistence. And in the stillness of the night, a quiet understanding settled over everyone involved. The case's resolution did not erase the shadow it had cast, but it illuminated the path forward. For Lisa's family, for the community, for the investigators, it was a reckoning that brought clarity, however painful. For Reeves, it was a reckoning that brought exposure, unavoidable and complete. The cold case of Texas 1995 had reached its final chapter in the narrative of law and consequence. Yet beyond evidence, beyond confessions, beyond the courtroom walls, the story remained alive in memory, in grief, in reflection. It lingered in the spaces between people, in the fields, in the houses, in the air that carried decades of unanswered questions. It was a reminder that truth has a persistence all its own, that even the deepest shadows cannot withstand the light of revelation indefinitely. And as the town slept, the echoes of the past whispered across streets, across homes, across hearts. 23 years of silence had ended. The line had finally snapped. The cold case was solved. And in its wake remained a quiet, lingering tension, a mixture of relief, grief, and the indelible mark left by the story that refused to be forgotten. The courtroom was still, heavy with anticipation, every breath drawn with the awareness that decades of silence had finally met consequence. Reeves stood, his expression unreadable, yet beneath it, the subtle tremor of a life long hidden began to surface. Years of control, of meticulous calculation, had finally been confronted by something immutable: the law, the truth, the eyes of a community that had waited 23 years for closure. Lisa Carter's family sat in the front row, hands clasped, knuckles white. Their grief had not faded over time. It had grown sharper, more acute with every unanswered question, every sleepless night, every shadowed anniversary. And now, the truth revealed, it struck with full force. The loss could not be undone, but at least the story was complete. The identity of the perpetrator was known. The weight of uncertainty lifted, replaced by a grief tempered by certainty. Reeves listened to the testimony, the DNA reports, the carefully laid timeline, the witnesses recalling fragments long forgotten. Each fact, each corroboration, each painstakingly reconstructed detail chipped away at the remaining walls of his composure. He did not shout. He did not protest. He did not flee. He merely remained measured, aware, but increasingly aware that the decades of careful silence could no longer shield him. Outside, the town seemed to exhale collectively. Streets that had once felt ordinary now carried echoes of history. Conversations drifted to Lisa, to her life, to the questions that had been unanswered for far too long. Neighbors spoke in low tones of the shock, of the relief, of the lingering sorrow. The cold case, once a phantom haunting the edges of memory, now had a form, a face, a reckoning. Back in the courtroom, Reeves' own acknowledgement was subtle but unmistakable. He did not confess further than he had already. He did not offer apologies or explanations beyond the facts painstakingly uncovered. But his posture, the slight slump of shoulders, the tight exhale, they spoke louder than words ever could. He had lived for decades in a world of shadows. Now, every shadow was illuminated. The verdict, when it came, was inevitable.
Guilty.
Not speculation, not suspicion, not circumstantial whispering, proven by DNA, corroborated by time, pattern, and patient investigation. Reeves was sentenced. The gavel fell, a sound that echoed far beyond the walls of the courthouse. For the family, for the investigators, for the community, it was both an end and a beginning. Closure mingled with the awareness that scars do not vanish simply because justice has been rendered. Reeves was escorted out, moving with the same quiet rhythm that had characterized him for decades. His control was intact, outwardly, yet inside, the decades of secrecy, of manipulation, of silence, had given way to the permanence of consequence. He was no longer just a man accused. He was a man accountable, stripped of the protections of time, exposure, and absence. The field where Lisa had been found remained untouched, a solemn witness. Grass swayed gently in the wind, as if acknowledging the end of a long-held secret. The house where she had last been seen stood silent, windows reflecting the sunlight, shadows marking the place where her life had ended. Evidence, once hidden, had revealed the truth. Silence, once absolute, had been broken. In the community, the echoes lingered. Conversations, memories, grief, and reflection intertwined. They spoke of loss, of resilience, of the persistent search for justice. 23 years had shaped them all, investigators hardened by persistence, families marked by absence, a community defined by the weight of unsolved questions. And now, with the cold case resolved, the narrative could finally be told in full. Reeves, alone in his cell that night, faced the permanence of consequence. The careful calculations, the meticulous concealment, the decades of silence. None of it could undo the past. He had been revealed, accounted for, confronted with the truth he had long evaded. And in that reckoning, there was no escape. No further strategy, no manipulation, no possibility of bending the narrative. Only the weight of what had been done, what had been revealed, and what could never be undone. The town, the family, the investigators, all had closure. The cold case was no longer cold. The story, brutal, jagged, and real, had found its voice. And though scars would remain, though grief would linger, though the shadows would never fully disappear, the truth had been laid bare. The line had snapped. The silence had ended. Justice had been rendered. Yet even as the sun set over Texas, painting streets and fields in gold and shadow, there remained an undeniable residue. The echoes of the past, the permanence of choices, the inescapable weight of a life lost, and the enduring mark left on everyone who had waited, watched, and finally confronted the story that refused to remain hidden. The cold case of Texas 1995 was solved. The suspect exposed. The truth undeniable. And in its resolution lay the final lesson that even the darkest secrets, no matter how deeply buried, eventually find their way into the light, shaping the lives of all who remain. Even after the courtroom emptied, even after the gavel had fallen and Reeves had been escorted away, the echoes of the case lingered. The town didn't return immediately to normal. Streets felt different, conversations carried a new weight, and every familiar corner seemed touched by memory. The shadows of the past had been illuminated, but illumination does not erase what was once dark. The memory of Lisa Carter, her absence, and the slow, agonizing uncertainty of her disappearance remained alive in every whispered recollection. Investigators lingered over details, reviewing photographs, reports, and timelines one last time. Years of persistence, patience, and meticulous work had brought closure, but they knew the impact extended beyond evidence. The case had shaped them as profoundly as it had shaped the families, carving lessons about vigilance, human behavior, and the consequences of silence. Every page of the files, every note in the margin, every photograph of the field or the house told a story not just of crime, but of endurance, obsession, and the long arc of justice. Reeves, alone in his cell, faced a different kind